A religious ceremony at the National Cathedral on Friday. Then he will be taken back on that same plane out to California to the Reagan Library in Simi Valley, California, where he will be buried. In fact, Nancy Reagan has already picked out a burial plot for herself alongside her beloved former president and former husband, late husband, I should say. We're joined right now by Keith. Let's go right now to Pete Williams. We've got to get an update and seal this thing down so nobody's worried about what happened here a few moments ago. There was a bit of a scare at the U.S. Capitol. I'm going to have Pete Williams of NBC News explain what happened. Pete.
Well, and Chris, just to emphasize, it was a false alarm, but an understandable one. What we are told by several federal agencies is that a plane coming into Reagan Airport was just across the river from Washington, D.C., and very, very close to the U.S. Capitol, was somehow off course, alarmingly enough that the federal agents involved made the decision to, in essence, send the word out that the plane might be headed for the Capitol. Now, that turned out to be wrong. There was no danger here. And we're not certain exactly which plane it was, but that's what happened, Chris.
Pete, who makes the decision as to these kinds of alerts? Not the different colors of the spectrum alerts, but when you tell people to race out of a building, take your shoes off and run for your life, who makes those calls?
Well, this whole operation here is in charge of the Secret Service, so they're making these calls. The U.S. Secret Service.
Okay, thank you very much, Pete Williams with NBC News. Let's go right now and take a look at the plane. What a dramatic sight. Of course, it's one of those strange moments in American transportation history, I must say, where we're all watching the same flight. I've got Keith Oberman joining me right now. Keith, isn't it odd? Here we are watching a plane take off from California, heading eastward, and here we are watching it arrive at this end. I mean, it's such a sad statement on the day, but it's just an amazing technology here. That plane must have gotten here in a couple of hours.
Think of Lincoln's funeral procession and the stops at the dozen or more cities by train, and even in obviously an earlier part of our own time, the train that carried Robert Kennedy back, and that long, slow procession that took 2 or 3 days in June of 1968. This has changed utterly. That plane, it has condensed, like everything else in life, as you know, condensed it into a couple of hours, as you just suggested.
Well, maybe we lose something with planes because it's very hard to stand along the flight route and salute. I remember those scenes of working people, black and white, standing along the train tracks of New Jersey, standing there with like T-shirts on, and people with no money at all.
Right.
Standing
Flags,
there with salutes, dirty faces,
waves.
It was maybe one of the great times of American unity on a sad day.
And silence, but uniform respect, and as you say, a spectrum of the American population in 1968. And yes, the technology changes things. I think we'll get some of that same emotion and heartfelt farewell to the individual involved, in this case obviously President Reagan, during our procession here from that when they finally disembark and bring down the president's casket.
Well, we're going to have quite an evening, a spectacle here. That's another alarm going off. I have no idea what that one is, but we've been hearing a lot of them lately around here. We're up in the Teamsters building, an unusual spot for us, with this beautiful perspective on the U.S. Capitol.
Which they were, some people were running from. I must say I was down in that crowd as the building was evacuated. Some were running, but most weren't. There seemed almost no sense of panic down there.
The New Yorkers, you noted, were the ones that were the calmest.
No, the New Yorkers were the ones who ignored the sirens. Everybody else ran there, and in New York we run and worry when there's no siren at all. No, this was fairly orderly, but there was a slight sense of alarm, but nothing significant. And to be fair to what was done down there, however quickly everybody was evacuated, I've never seen the reverse of that, the dis-evacuation, take place faster. This was all over inside of about 10 minutes. Once the all clear was in, everybody was back in line to go see the Capitol. And the thing that was the most wide-heard complaint down on the street down there on Connecticut was people who were waiting to get into the Capitol had lost their space in line.
I don't blame them.
They're all upset.
It's a hot day to wait.
It's a hot day to wait.
Especially when you have to go to the bathroom. You must cut all kinds of deals to leave for an hour, so have 20 minutes to get back in line. You know, we're going to see something here tonight, and anybody who has a chance to be near a television set, I think, in an hour, a couple hours from now, maybe an hour and a half. This dusk ceremony here in Washington is going to be one for the ages. We're going to see a hearse deliver the body of a former president to a caisson, which will then be put on that caisson, and it will be horse-drawn practically the length of Constitution Avenue, which is right over there.
Yep.
And they'll be drawn all the way up from where the White House is, all the way up here at a very slow cadence, all the way up to where the body will lie in state at the Rotunda, which is probably, as someone said in the paper today, our most dramatic stage, we Americans. It's the most, because it's where we put the bodies of our greatest people when they die. And we put it there for everyone to watch. Isn't it amazing, almost sacramental thing this country has?
What you just said about the cadence is the whole thing. We are living, as we're looking at these pictures of the jet arriving, we are living in this age and only getting faster and faster. And what we will see during this ceremony is of another age.
From 600 miles an hour to 20 miles an hour.
Yeah, or even less. It will be so slow and measured that the importance is essentially noted by the willingness to suspend our ordinary rules of transportation and get there faster, and that single horseless rider, which is, as we'll discuss later on, is a tradition that supposedly they buried they buried Tamerlane with a riderless horse in front of him, and Genghis Khan, in 12 whenever it was, but the elements from the 13th century. And when we see that caisson moving so slowly, anyone who was there to watch it in 1963, or anyone who's seen the film since, will be, I think, struck in the same way, even though the element of tragedy is not involved here, will be struck in the same way as they were when they heard or saw the Kennedy procession. It's that same tribute, not just to one particular president, but to all of them, I guess.
I wonder if we've ever had so iconic a president. If you think about him, coming out of the Midwest is itself an iconic reality. Becoming a baseball sportscaster on radio in those days, in the age of radio, that's another icon. Going to Hollywood and getting a screen test, because you look great to play the young football star George Gipp, and then playing a football star with Newt Rockne, another incredible icon, and then riding the trail with Earl Flynn and others, getting married with William Holden as your best man, going on GE Theater and becoming a primetime TV host with maybe 30 million people watching you every night, and it's #3 Nielsen rating, not top 3, along with I Love Lucy and Dragnet and Ronald Reagan, and then becoming governor of California. I forgot, Death Valley days.
Death Valley days, which he was criticized for leaving. He'll regret that someday, they wrote.
The plane that we're watching now in real time, the Air Force One, basically, it's brought back the body of President Reagan. It's landed now, come to full stop at Andrews Air Force Base. As you see it right now, we're going to be seeing the former First Family come out of that plane, and we're going to see, of course, the body of Ronald Reagan coming out of that other compartment, another exit on that plane. This is, of course, the brand new Air Force One. You know, Ronald Reagan never got to fly this one when he was...
And Reagan Democrats. Ronald Reagan, who died last Saturday, has been lying in repose at the Presidential Library in Simi Valley, California, where thousands of people, more than 100,000 altogether, paid tribute to him. His home state neighbors and people from the American West. Now his body has been borne east, so there can be a state funeral this evening in the nation's capital and a national funeral service on Friday morning at the National Cathedral. His death and the response to it is a reminder of the powerful effect of this optimistic Midwesterner on America. While he often decried the size of the U.S. government, he loved the rituals of the presidency. And he will now be honored with the full trappings and majesty of the United States. Military honor guards, heads of state from around the world, heads of government. His old colleagues, many of them are gone, of course. He lived to the age of 93, the oldest living American president. The trip from Andrews Air Force Base, which is just outside of Washington, D.C. in Maryland, will be not directly into the Capitol. It will swing into Virginia as well, so people in that state can also salute the former president. His casket will be taken to 16th and Constitution, where it will be loaded onto a caisson drawn by horses for the solemn and yet inspiring trip to the nation's capital. Dwight Eisenhower, Lyndon Johnson, and of course, John F. Kennedy, the presidents in our lifetime who've had state funerals. However prepared America was for the death of Ronald Reagan, he'd been ill for 10 years. The finality of it plainly touched so many people in so many ways. In California, NBC's George Lewis reported that there were so many immigrants who came to Simi Valley, to the Presidential Library, to pay tribute to him because they were drawn to his vision of this country as a city shining on the hill. On the plane coming east, Mrs. Reagan, her daughter Nancy, her son Ron Prescott, the president's son Michael, and other family members and friends. Mrs. Reagan has been so touched by the attention that she's received from daughter Patty and from Ron Prescott. They've had their ups and downs. She's been estranged, really, from Ron Prescott, and yet she told me that he has been such a helpmate to her this week, greeting everyone, comforting others, thanking people for the attention that they were paying to the death of his father and to his mother in this time of great grief. Ronald Reagan served in uniform during World War II, but only stateside. He was in a cinema unit making training films, and yet the military and the lore of the military was such an important part of his life to him. And no president saluted more smartly as he went on board Air Force One or left Marine One, returning to the White House, than the president did. At the Capitol, when the president's casket arrives, there's such an overflow crowd that they've had an extra viewing room, and his body will then lie in state following the state services in the Capitol Rotunda until 8 a.m. on Friday morning Eastern Time. And then it will be again carried through the streets of Washington, D.C. to the National Cathedral in Northwest Washington, a distance of about 3 miles, perhaps 4, where there will be services presided over by former Missouri Senator Jack Danforth, an Episcopal priest. President Bush will deliver the eulogy. Here now is Mrs. Reagan. Nancy Reagan was not only the love of his life, she was in many ways the best political advisor that he had. Great instincts about what was going on politically in this country, in the White House, and around the world. This is not Air Force One. As I said at the beginning, it's part of the Air Force One fleet. It's been designated SAM 28,000. Air Force One is a title reserved only when the president is on board. Other members of the family and friends who joined Mrs. Reagan for this bittersweet trip back to the nation's capital. Their marriage of 52 years was an unalloyed love story. It still, to their closest friends, brings expressions of awe. One of them said to me they could be separated for 5 hours, and when they greeted each other again, it was as if they had not seen each other in 20 years. The pallbearers at the service on Friday will be drawn from the president's circle of close friends, including Merv Griffin, a well-known television personality, hotel proprietor, and producer. Mike Deaver, who was with him from his days as governor of California as his public relations advisor and counselor and friend. Charles Wick, another friend, a producer in Los Angeles who came to Washington and worked in the USIA. Dr. Hutton, who was his personal physician. It's Charles Wick on the left there as you look. That's Michael Reagan in the sunglasses on the far left of your screen. And States Army Band, known as Pershing's Own from Fort Myer. the 21-gun salute to the president, and there will be a 21 airplane flyover, F-15 Strike Eagles.
Ready, step, hot, 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 hot.
Mrs. Reagan, who had accompanied her husband on so many triumphant trips overseas, returning to Andrews Air Force Base now in a United States government plane, probably for the last time, at the side of her husband. Trips to Moscow and England, Paris, Reykjavik, Iceland, memorable meetings with Gorbachev. Geneva, the first meeting with Gorbachev, the commander of the greatest power in the free world met the commander of the greatest power in the communist world and began to forge a new relationship and create out of that relationship a new world. Someone has estimated that there are 1 billion people free today politically that were not before Ronald Reagan took office. The collapse of the Soviet Union, the rise of democracy in Central America and South America, of course. Douglas Brinkley, the noted American historian, joins us now as we watch this scene. Douglas, historians always like to take a little more time to make a judgment about a president, but on the matter of his personal popularity and his commitment to freeing people and standing up to communism, there can be no doubt about Ronald Reagan. right, we'll get to Douglas in just a few moments. Congressman Christopher Cox. As soon as we get our technical difficulties worked out, we'll be hearing from them and from many others during the course of our coverage from here into the nation's capital, from 16th and Constitution, the stately procession to the nation's Capitol building and the rotunda there. Congressman Christopher Cox of Orange County, California, served in the Reagan White House right out of Harvard Law School. That commitment to the Reagan foreign policy and his personal political philosophy, wasn't it, Congressman?
Well, there's no question, you know.
And after leaving Point Mugu, he made the long trip across the country. And Sam 28,000, as that 747 was called. And as he makes his way through Maryland, he'll also go into Virginia. And then he'll begin at 16th and Constitution. His body will be worn on a caisson, horse-drawn. They'll have the riderless horse with the boots in backward, in reverse. That's a long tradition on the battlefield. And they didn't have trouble finding riding boots in Ronald Reagan's museum. These are old cavalry here in Washington and, of course, at his ranch in Santa Barbara, where he rode on a regular basis in a very, very remote part. And so caisson, of course, was used originally in this country to carry artillery to the battlefield and to bring bodies back from the battlefield. We all became too familiar with it during the time of the burial of John F. Kennedy, a funeral ceremony that Jacqueline Kennedy modeled very closely on the funeral of Abraham Lincoln. The horse, which will come from the Old Guard unit just across the river in Fort Myers, Virginia, is called a caparison. That means it's been dressed in finery. That's a tradition that goes back to the time of Genghis Khan and Mongolians when they were riding to battle. You know, a great was killed, his horse was led back and often sacrificed at the time of the burial. That is no longer the case, obviously, but it is a rich military tradition to have a riderless horse dressed up and the boots in the stirrup, but backward. The nation's capital, they had a momentary scare there earlier this afternoon when a plane veered into restricted airspace, and they asked for the Capitol to be evacuated, but the all clear came very quickly. There was no panic of any kind, but momentary concern because terrorism does remain a great threat here. NBC's Andrea Mitchell is in our Washington bureau chief. And she has been Andrea, of course, is White House correspondent during the Reagan years and has stayed in close touch with the family as well. Andrea, haven't you been struck as well by the great outpouring? Everyone knew that there was enormous affection for Ronald Reagan, but I think that there was some concern even among his admirers about whether the country would turn out for him in this fashion because he's been so ill and out of sight for so long.
Indeed, and I think Nancy Reagan has been very struck by it. She put out a statement yesterday saying how grateful and how inspired she was by the outpouring of affection in California. After all, Ronald Reagan was governor of California in the 1960s, yet people still seem to be responding. I think, Tom, it's possibly also because we are at a time of war, a great time of difficulty in this country, and Ronald Reagan, of course, represented such great optimism and hope.
I agree with you completely, Andrea. This is a reignition of the old feelings that they had when he came to office and restored the spirit of the country. He was an authentic American, and a president who had great clarity of vision, and they're responding to that. We'll be back at 6 Eastern Time with continuing coverage of this day of the state funeral of President Ronald Wilson Reagan. I'm Tom Brokaw in Washington.
From an NBC News special report.